Voudounne Rising Tides of the Bayou Chapter 1, Awakening of the Loa, The Echoes of Blood and Roots. Celeste Broussard never asked for the power that now surged through her veins. Born and raised in the heart of South Louisiana's bayous, she had always been attuned to the land's whispers, the way the trees seemed to shudder under unseen weight, the thick scent of damp earth carrying stories older than time. The Broussards had lived in these swamps for generations, bound to the cycles of life, death, and spirits that moved in the in-between. Her grandmother, Tante Evangeline, Mama V to most, was a traiteur, a healer of both body and spirit, keeper of rites that stretched back to the old country and beyond. Mama V had always said power was a gift and a burden, but Celeste never understood the weight of those words until the night the bayou went silent. A storm on the horizon. It began with the land's unease. The usual chorus of crickets and bullfrogs had faded into unnatural quiet, leaving only the thick pulse of the humid air pressing against her skin. Celeste sat on the wooden steps of Mama V's cabin, staring into the darkness, the fireflies keeping their own nervous rhythm. Mama V rocked slowly in her chair, her gnarled fingers pressing into her rosary with a tension that made Celeste's stomach turn. "Something is coming," Mama V murmured, her voice tight with knowing. Something old, something angry. The machines and the sin of greed. The spirits had been restless for weeks, their warnings subtle at first. Shadows moving in the cypress trees, whispers curling through the wind like morning sighs. Then the men came with their drilling rigs, machines slicing into the land like knives carving flesh, disrupting what should never have been touched. The corporations had been warned, but greed does not listen, and neither does ignorance. They didn't know that beneath the waters, something ancient stirred, something that did not forgive trespass. Mama V had shaken her head when the first trees were felled, her voice carrying a grave warning. The land don't forget, the dead don't forgive. The night of reckoning. The fire started in the dead of night, its glow like an open wound against the darkness. Celeste awoke to the scent of burning oil, thick and acrid, a taste of corruption in the air. The screams came next, harsh, unnatural, twisted by something far worse than pain. She ran barefoot through the damp earth, heart pounding, drawn toward the horror unfolding beyond the trees. What she found at the clearing made her blood run cold. Men from the drilling company, their bodies contorted as if unseen hands had bent them into shapes no human should take. The bayou watched. And in the shadows, something moved. Two pair of glowing red eyes peered from the darkness, the guttural growl beneath them vibrating through Celeste's ribs. The rougarou. The old stories had spoken of it, a creature neither man nor beast, a curse born of broken oaths and sins unpaid. But this was more than a monster's wrath. This was the spirit's fury made flesh. The trees groaned as a wind swept through the clearing, and Celeste felt it then. The Loa calling, the weight of their power pressing into her bones. She reached into her pocket, gripping the gris-gris bag Mama V had given her, and whispered the words she had been taught, calling upon Papa Legba, the gatekeeper of the spirit world. Epilogue, a path chosen. The world blurred, time slipping through her fingers as a vision seized her. She saw the past, the stolen land, the blood spilled into the soil, the forgotten ones buried beneath industry's greed. She saw the future, shadow creeping over the bayou, something far worse than the rougarou rising from the depths. And when she came back to herself, she knew. She was no longer just Celeste Broussard. She was Voudounne now, the bridge between the living and the dead, chosen to restore the balance before it was too late. Mama V stood at the edge of the clearing, her old eyes knowing, her voice heavy with certainty. "It's begun, child," she said. "Ain't no turning back now." Celeste looked down at the bodies of the men who had paid the price for their trespass. No, there was no turning back. The spirits had called her, and whatever lay ahead, she would face it. As she turned toward the bayou, the mist curled around her feet, leading her toward the path she was meant to walk. Chapter 2. The Bayou Circle. Gathers a lone warrior cannot win the war. The morning after the spirits called her, Celeste stood at the banks of the slow-moving bayou, the humidity pressing down like an unseen hand. The battle from the night before had left a weight in her chest, a feeling that went beyond exhaustion. She had seen what happened to those who disrupted the balance, twisted bodies, fire licking at the treetops, the rougarous' crimson eyes burning in the dark. The Loa had spoken, but their message was layered in shadow, their voices cryptic even as they lingered in her mind. If she was to stand against what was rising in the bayou, she could not do it alone. She needed wisdom, she needed warriors, and she needed answers. Seeking the keeper of secrets. Before she sought those who could fight, she had to find the one who could tell her what she was truly up against. Père Lenoir had lived deep in the swamp longer than most cared to remember. Some called him a priest, others a mystic, but to Celeste, he had always been the man who carried the weight of the land's secrets. If the spirits whispered of danger, Père Lenoir had already heard them screaming. Her path wound through twisted cypress trees and gnarled roots, the swamp shifting under her feet as she approached the old chapel. It was barely standing, half swallowed by the bayou's hunger, its wooden bones warped by time and the elements. Yet, the cross above the entrance still held firm, wrapped in Spanish moss and draped in the lingering energy of prayers both answered and ignored. She stepped inside. The scent of burning sage and damp wood filled the air. Candles flickered along the altar, their glow casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. Père Lenoir sat at a rough-hewn table, his fingers idly rolling a small bone charm between them. He did not look up as she entered, but his voice carried through the stillness. "You're late, child." He set the bone down with a soft clack. "I've been expecting you." Celeste took a breath. "Then you know why I'm here." He exhaled slowly, finally lifting his gaze to hers. His eyes, dark, deep as the swamp itself, measured her with something that sat between understanding and warning. The land been whisperin', the spirits restless. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. Whatever done been let loose ain't stoppin' till blood gets spilled, and not just the kind that soaks the earth. Celeste swallowed against the weight of those words. "The Leviathan?" she asked. Père Lenoir's expression darkened. "That beast ain't the real threat, Philly. It's just a warning, a shadow cast before the real darkness arrives." He tapped his fingers against the wood, slow and deliberate. "What you saw, that was only the beginning." A shudder ran through her, though she kept her posture steady. "Then tell me what's coming." He studied her for a long moment before reaching into his pocket, pulling out a small vial filled with something dark, almost black. "Take this." Celeste frowned as she took it, feeling the cool glass press into her palm. "What is it?" "Insurance." His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You'll know when to use it." She didn't ask more. Père Lenoir never gave explanations unless he wanted to. Instead, she tightened her grip on the vial, nodding once. "You ain't the first to stand at this crossroads, child, and you won't be the last." His voice softened, but his words pressed into her ribs like a blade. "But I got a feeling you might be the one to walk through it and come out the other side." Celeste tucked the vial into her pocket, knowing better than to question a man who had spent his life listening to the dead. "You going to need more than knowledge to win this fight," he murmured. "You need a circle." Seeking the swamp's protector, she took Père Lenoir's advice to heart. Her first stop was Solomon Carter, a man who had spent his life hunting things that did not belong in the world of the living. A former Marine, he had seen war on two fronts, the one fought with bullets and the one waged in the spaces between the veil of life and death. She found him by the docks, his hands moving with practiced ease as he loaded salt rounds into his shotgun. His face was carved from stone, his dark eyes scanning her with the wariness of a man who had already seen too much. "I don't mess with magic," he said gruffly, not looking up. "But I know when the land is wrong, and it's wrong, Celeste." She told him about the spirit's warning, about the men broken in ways that no natural force could manage. Solomon exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening on the shotgun. "Once we start down this road," he said, "there ain't no turning back." Celeste met his gaze, unflinching. "There's nothing left to turn back to." After a long pause, he nodded. "Then we do this right." The truth seeker's aid. Next, she sought Annette Nettie-Doucet, an investigative journalist who had spent months digging into the corporations that came to carve up the bayou. Nettie was sharp, sharp-witted, sharp-tongued, and sharp enough to survive in places most people wouldn't dare tread. Celeste found her in a smoky backroom of a bar in Lafourche Parish, her fingers tapping against a folder filled with evidence that no official would ever acknowledge. "They think they can bury the truth," she muttered, snapping a cigarette in half, "but they don't know what's already buried beneath them." Nettie had seen too many missing persons reports tied to the drilling sites, too many cases of land stolen under false pretenses. "This isn't just about spirits," she said, leaning forward. "Something else is happening here. These men aren't just drilling, they're searching for something, and whatever they've disturbed, it was never meant to be found." Celeste felt the confirmation settle in her gut like lead. The corporations were not the only enemy in this fight. Something older had been awoken, and it would not rest. The trickster Etienne T. John Dugas was a harder sell. A smuggler and a liar, he had built his life in the spaces between law and legend. But he had ears in every shadow, and Celeste needed his knowledge. She found him at a dockside poker table, grinning as he took another man's money with the ease of someone who never played fair. "Voudounne," he greeted, his smirk widening. "Word travels fast in the swamp. The spirits chose you, huh?" He leaned back, considering her. "Hope you're ready for what's coming." Celeste leveled her gaze at him. "You don't work for anyone, T. Jean, but if you want to survive what's coming, you'll stand with me." He studied her for a moment, then chuckled. "Fair enough." The Guardians of the Bayou, Celeste's final stop, took her deeper than she had ever dared to go alone, into the Gauthier lands, where the Bayou belonged to no man, only to the spirits and those who walked with them. The twins, Claudette and Baptiste Gauthier, were not just protectors of the old ways. They were part of them. Their ancestors had lived in the swamps before Louisiana had a name, their lineage woven into the roots of the cypress trees, their blood steeped in the whispers of the Loa. Some said the twins were born under an eclipse, touched by the spirits before they took their first breath. Others swore they were the last true heirs of the Bayou's magic, the last ones who knew how to listen. Celeste found them where she expected, at the edge of Lac Noir, a place no outsider dared tread after dark. The lake was said to be a mirror between worlds, where spirits gathered and the past bled into the present. Baptiste was crouched near the water, a sharp knife in his hands, carving symbols into a wooden talisman. His presence was solid, unshaken, the kind of man who could hold the weight of the world without flinching. His long, thick dreadlocks were pulled back with twine, his dark skin gleaming under the last traces of sunlight. Claudette stood nearby, fingers trailing over the lake's surface, her lips moving in an unspoken prayer. Where Baptiste was grounded, she was untethered, eyes always half in this world, half in another. Her wild curls framed a sharp, intelligent face, her long silver rings clinking together as she moved. "You ain't never come this far on your own," Baptiste said without looking up, his deep voice carrying over the water. "I wouldn't have," Celeste admitted, "but I didn't have much of a choice." Claudette turned to her then, her dark eyes unreadable. "The spirit's been whispering about you, Celeste Broussard." Her voice was a slow, knowing drawl, like she was pulling words from somewhere deeper than thought. "They say the Loa got their hands on you now." Celeste tightened her grip on her staff. "I didn't ask for that." Claudette's lips curled into a small, amused smile. "They don't ask neither." Baptiste finally stood, tucking the wooden talisman into his pocket. "What is it you need?" His tone wasn't dismissive, but it wasn't welcoming either. "A war's coming," Celeste said, meeting his gaze, "and the spirits won't stay quiet much longer. I need people who know how to listen." The twins exchanged a glance, some unspoken thought passing between them. They had always been like this, a single force split into two bodies, moving with the kind of unity only blood and magic could forge. Claudette sighed, rolling her shoulders. "We knew this was comin'. Been knowin' for a while." Baptiste nodded, his expression serious. "Ain't no point fightin' fate, I suppose." Celeste exhaled, the weight in her chest loosening slightly. "Then you're with me?" Claudette's grin was sharp, her fingers dancing along the beaded talismans around her neck. "Course we are, Cher. Who else gonna make sure you don't get yourself killed?" Baptiste smirked. "Somebody gotta keep you from pissin' off the wrong spirits." Celeste let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The circle was coming together. And just in time. Epilogue. The circle forms as the last rays of sun bled into the horizon. Celeste stood with her allies, the warriors, the seekers, the tricksters, and the guardians. They were a strange circle, each carrying their own ghosts, their own scars. But the spirits did not choose lightly. The land had been disturbed, the dead had been angered, and war was coming. Chapter 3. The Leechman's Curse. A gathering storm. The bayou had always been alive, but now it seethed. The air was thick with the scent of damp moss and something fouler, something rotting beneath the surface. The cicadas were silent, the frogs had ceased their midnight songs, and even the trees seemed to hold their breath. Celeste could feel it in her bones, in the uneasy way the spirits coiled around her like watchful sentries. The land had been wounded, and from that wound, something had begun to fester. They followed Père Lenoir's warnings deep into the swamp, past half-sunken ruins and skeletal cypress trees draped in ghostly veils of Spanish moss. He had spoken of creatures that did not belong in either world, the living or the dead. Creatures that fed on suffering, growing fat on despair. "They are the forgotten ones," he had murmured, his voice heavy with old grief. "The land remembers them, but no one else does." Celeste did not know what frightened her more, the truth in his words, or the sense that the land itself was trying to swallow them whole. The feeding ground. They reached the ruins of an old sugar plantation, its crumbling pillars jutting from the earth like broken teeth. The land here reeked of something unnatural, something wrong. The trees were wrapped in blackened vines, their bark split and oozing sap that gleamed like tar. The air buzzed, not with insects, but with a presence that made Celeste's skin crawl. Nettie ran her fingers along the charred remains of an old shack, her sharp eyes scanning the land. "This place has seen death," she murmured, "not just the kind that ends in a grave." Then the air shifted. They came from the shadows, twisted figures with bloated skin and black, empty eyes. They moved in eerie unison, their limbs jerking unnaturally, as though they had forgotten how to be human. Their flesh was pale and sickly, but it pulsed, throbbed with something beneath the surface, something feeding inside them. Celeste barely had time to whisper a warning before one of them lunged. The battle for the Bayou Solomon fired first. The shotgun's blast ripped through the air, salt and iron shattering the silence. The leechman staggered, but did not fall. Instead, the wound in its chest closed, the flesh knitting back together as though the bullet had never touched it. Jean cursed. "Well, that ain't fair." The creatures moved fast, their bodies jerking forward in unnatural, skittering bursts. One reached for Nettie, its fingers elongating into something thin and wiry, something more like roots than bone. Celeste slammed her staff into the earth, calling on the Loa, her voice a command that cut through the air like a blade. The ground responded. Roots exploded from the soil, thick and gnarled, wrapping around the leechman's limbs. They shrieked, their voices high and piercing, like steam escaping a kettle. The spirits in the trees stirred, their whispers growing into a howl. The creatures were not meant to be here. They were parasites, feeding on wounds that had never healed. And the bayou had had enough. The wind carried the echoes of the past, whispers of forgotten laborers, men and women who had been swallowed by these fields, their names lost to history. The Loa had not abandoned them. Their vengeance lived here. Celeste raised her staff again, her voice rising over the cacophony. "You do not belong," the spirits answered. A gust of wind ripped through the ruins, and the creatures screamed, not from pain, but from something deeper. They were being pulled, their forms flickering, the spirits of the land dragging them back to whatever darkness had birthed them. Their bodies contorted, limbs twisting unnaturally, their bloated flesh collapsing inward, as if something unseen was devouring them from the inside. And then, silence. The air settled, the trees exhaled, the bayou for the first time in weeks breathed, but the victory felt hollow. The rising threat, Celeste stood among the ruins, her heart hammering, her skin slick with sweat. The leechmen were gone, but something remained, a heaviness in the air, a lingering whisper at the edge of her hearing. The battle had drawn something else's attention. A low rumble shook the ground. The fissure opened without warning, a jagged wound in the earth, as though the land itself was trying to scream. A thick mist poured from the crack, curling into the air like fingers reaching for a throat. And then she heard it, a voice, not one, but many, layered over each other like echoes collapsing into themselves, neither male nor female, neither living nor dead. You dare disturb the balance? The mist thickened, coiling around her ankles. The bayou had been bleeding for too long, and now something old had finally woken up. Epilogue, the next step. Celeste clenched her jaw, gripping her staff so tightly her knuckles ached. The leechmen were merely the first warning. The true threat still waited beyond the veil, watching, waiting, moving closer. Père Lenoir stepped forward, his expression grim. "We have to go deeper," he murmured. "We need answers before it's too late." Celeste exhaled, feeling the weight of what lay ahead settle against her ribs like a shroud. The battle had been won, but the war had just begun. Chapter 4. The Bone-Caller's Oath. Echoes in the Marsh. The morning mist clung to the bayou like the last breath of the dead, thick and unyielding as Celeste led the bayou circle deeper into the heart of the swamp. The battle with the leechmen had drained them, but she knew the true fight had yet to come. Something ancient had been stirred awake, something that watched them from the shadows, waiting. The Loa whispered in riddles, their voices tangled in the wind, but one thing was clear, the balance was slipping. If they did not act, the bayou would drown beneath the weight of its own dead. Their path led them to Lac Trouvé, a place whispered about in cautionary tales. Once a thriving village, it had been swallowed by the swamp decades ago, its ruins buried beneath tangled vines and murky waters. But its power had never faded. Somewhere among the remnants of that lost place, a bone-caller remained, the last of a line who could command the restless dead. If the spirits would not speak freely, Celeste would find the one who could make them listen. The path of the ancestors. The deeper they walked, the heavier the air became, thick with the scent of decay and something older, something sacred. Solomon gripped his shotgun tighter, eyes scanning the trees. "This place feels wrong," he muttered. "It ain't wrong," Claudette corrected softly. "It's waiting." The village's remains revealed themselves slowly, broken foundations buried beneath layers of moss, skeletal wooden beams jutting from the ground like the ribs of some great beast, and at its center stood Isabeau Delacroix. She was waiting for them. The bone-caller stood still as a statue, her robes faded with age, her pale eyes staring into a world no one else could see. Her fingers traced sigils into the damp earth, her staff pressed into the mud as though it held her tethered to reality. "You seek the truth," she murmured before Celeste could speak. "But truth is never given, it is taken." The keeper of secrets, Isabeau, did not move, did not look at them. Her voice was like reeds rustling in the wind, brittle yet unyielding. "The spirits whisper, but their voices are tangled in blood and betrayal." She gestured toward the ruined village. "This place has stories left unfinished. Do you have the courage to listen?" Celeste stepped forward, the weight of her ancestors pressing against her shoulders. "We don't have time for riddles. Something has woken up. It's spreading." Isabeau exhaled slowly, finally turning toward them. "I know. It is why you were chosen." Her gaze fell on Celeste's staff, then lingered on her hands, hands that had already bled for the Loa. "You are marked," she said, "but you are not yet claimed." The price of knowledge. The bone-caller agreed to help them, but knowledge did not come freely. "The dead do not speak for nothing," she warned. "A sacrifice must be made." Celeste knew what that meant before Isabeau even placed the blade in her hand. She had spent her life learning the old ways. Power had a cost. No offering, no knowledge. She swallowed hard, then sliced her palm, letting her blood drip into the ancient well at the center of the ruins. The earth shuddered. The wind howled as a low wail rose from the ground, twisting into a chorus of voices, shadows shifting through the ruins, whispers curling through the air like smoke. Then through the din came a single clear voice. "The dead is not settled." Celeste's breath hitched. She had expected warnings, riddles, but this? The dead were not merely angry, they were waiting for payment. The coming storm. Isabeau closed her eyes, listening, then nodded grimly. "The force you seek is not merely restless, it is vengeful." Her fingers traced the edge of the well. "It was bound once, long ago. But men have broken its chains with their greed, and now it is rising to collect its due." Celeste felt the weight of those words settle in her chest. This wasn't just about the drilling. It wasn't just about spirits disturbed. Something owed a debt, and now the land itself was calling for it to be paid. Chapter 5. The Blood Moon's Warning, a Bayou in Mourning. The night sky stretched endlessly above them, heavy with the weight of the unknown. The bayou had always been dark, but tonight that darkness felt alive, watching, shifting, waiting for something unseen. Celeste could hear the whispers in the wind, could feel the ground breathing beneath her feet. The spirits were trying to warn them, but their voices were tangled in something older, something stronger. They were running out of time. The bayou circle moved carefully, their steps measured, their senses on edge. Even the swamp itself seemed hesitant to disturb the silence, as though it knew what loomed just beyond sight. Then, through the trees, a light cut through the blackness. The moon was bleeding. The blood moon rises. The moon hung low, its surface washed in crimson, casting the land in a sickly red glow. A blood moon. Nettie's breath hitched. This ain't natural. It's more than that, Isabeau whispered. It's a summoning. Celeste tightened her grip on her staff, feeling the Loa stir within her bones. The veil was thin tonight, and something was moving beyond it, something that had been waiting for this exact moment. Then came the first scream, the first strike. The trees shook, the wind howled, and from the shadows, figures emerged. They moved unnaturally, bodies twisted, eyes hollow, their skins stretched tight over jagged bones. Their chains rattled as they dragged themselves forward, their mouths open in silent, endless screams. Les enchaînés, Isabeau breathed, the chained ones. Spirits bound by vengeance and despair, forgotten souls who had never found rest. And now they had been called. The fight for survival, Solomon raised his shotgun. Move. The first shot cracked through the night, salt and iron bursting through the air. One of the chained ones reeled, but did not fall. They were not like the leechmen. These were spirits trapped between worlds, their pain giving them form. Celeste raised her staff, her voice rising over the chaos. Baron Samedi, lend me your fire! The ground split open, a gust of wind howling through the clearing, sending the creatures reeling. Nettie whispered rapid incantations, the words curling into the night like embers, weaving a shield around them. But Celeste felt it then. Something bigger was waiting. This was only the first test. The veil tears. As the last of the chained ones fell, the air shifted. The blood moon flared, the mist thickening around them, curling into unseen hands. A voice, deep, ancient, knowing, whispered through the night. You do not understand what you have awakened. Celeste swallowed hard. They weren't just fighting vengeful spirits anymore. The thing behind the veil was coming, and this time it would not be stopped. Chapter 6. The Rift Unsealed, Echoes of the Past. The night was heavy with silence, but Celeste could feel the weight of unseen eyes. The blood moon had come and gone, leaving behind a wound in the fabric of the world, a thinning of the veil between the living and the dead. The Bayou Circle stood at the ruins of an ancient crossing, the place where the spirits had first whispered their warnings. Gnarled cypress trees surrounded them, their twisted limbs reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The land here was older than memory, older than the names carved into its soil, and now it pulsed with something unnatural. Père Lenoir traced the symbols carved into the trees, his breath coming in short, measured exhales. This was once a bridge, he murmured, a place where the living could ask the dead for guidance. But now it's an open wound. His fingers lingered over a sigil burned deep into the bark, a warning from those who had walked this land long before them. Celeste shivered, feeling the whisper of something unseen pass through her. The air was charged, thick with an energy that did not belong. Celeste clenched her staff, feeling the familiar weight of the spirits pressing against her. She had seen the way the chained ones had moved, the unnatural hunger in their hollow eyes. Something had set them loose, and worse, something had called them. The spirits did not rise for no reason, and whatever had broken the rift wide open had done so with intent. Her gut told her this was no accident. Something had peeled it open wider, like flesh torn from an old scar. We have to seal it, Solomon said, his voice low but firm. Whatever's coming through, it's only going to get worse. He adjusted the shotgun slung across his back, his gaze sharp and wary. This was not the kind of war he had fought before, but battle was battle, and he knew when the enemy was already gathering. Isabeau stepped forward, pressing her palm against the nearest tree. It's not that simple. This rift, it wasn't made by us, it was made by something older, something that doesn't belong to the land. She turned, her pale eyes locking onto Celeste. And whatever it is, it's still coming. T. let out a slow breath, rubbing the back of his neck. Great. So we're fighting a war on two fronts. One against spirits, and one against whatever's got a grip on the other side of that rift. His voice carried the forced ease of a man who knew the weight of death but still cracked jokes to keep it from pressing too hard. Nettie pulled a small notebook from her coat. I've been tracking the drilling sites, she said. Every time they expand, we get more activity. It's not a coincidence. They're trying to dig something up, and whatever it is, it's tied to that rift. Celeste inhaled deeply, staring into the dark waters of the bayou. Then we find it, she said, and we stop it before it rips the whole damn veil apart. Chapter 7. Beneath the Black Water, a Descent into the Unknown. The water was colder than it should have been. Celeste felt the shift in temperature the moment they stepped onto the wooden skiff, their boat gliding silently through the still waters of the bayou. The air was thick, heavy with something more than just humidity. It was expectation, the kind that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The deeper they moved into the swamp, the more the silence pressed in, suffocating the natural chorus of insects and frogs. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath. Last chance to turn back, T. muttered, gripping the oar tightly. His voice held no real hope that they would. No turning back, Celeste said. Not anymore. The boat drifted toward the abandoned drilling site, its silhouette stark against the skeletal remains of trees long drowned by the encroaching water. The machinery loomed above them, rusting and broken, but something beneath it still pulsed with life, something old and waiting. The rift's energy curled around the edges of the site, like invisible fingers clawing at reality itself. As they approached, Isabeau muttered a prayer under her breath. The land remembers, she whispered. The water holds its secrets. And then the first ripple appeared. The surface of the bayou, still as glass just moments before, trembled as if something massive was shifting beneath it. A low, guttural groan echoed from the depths, a sound that vibrated through Celeste's bones. The water did not stir as if something swam beneath it. It shuddered, recoiling from the presence of something that did not belong. And then the water exploded. Chapter 8. The Old God's Name. A warning from the Loa. The fire crackled in the center of Mama V's hut, casting long shadows against the walls. Celeste sat cross-legged before it, her staff resting across her lap, listening to the old woman's voice as she spoke of things long buried. The scent of burning herbs filled the small room, masking the damp, earthen smell that always lingered in the swamp. Outside, the bayou whispered, the wind carrying voices that only those attuned to the spirits could hear. The Leviathan ain't just a beast child, Mama V said. It's a servant. Celeste frowned. A servant of what? Mama V's gaze was heavy with sorrow, something the world forgot to fear. The old woman reached into a small wooden box, pulling out a faded parchment, the ink smudged with age. Symbols, ones Celeste didn't recognize, covered its surface, but one word stood out, written in dark, angry strokes. Abezathibu. Celeste whispered the name aloud, and the fire flared. The walls groaned, the wooden beams stretching as if something was pressing against them from the outside. A distant splash echoed through the bayou, something moving in the water, something listening. Mama V grabbed Celeste's wrist, her grip iron-strong despite her frail appearance. You say that name again, and you might not live to regret it. Celeste swallowed hard, her pulse racing. What is it? Mama V exhaled, her voice low and steady. A god of the deep, she murmured, one that was cast out long before men knew how to write his name. He don't belong to this world, but someone is trying to bring him back. The air in the hut grew thick, pressing against Celeste's skin. The Leviathan was just the beginning, and now it knew she knew. Chapter 9. The Drums of War. The bayou circle gathers. The air was thick with the scent of burning sage and rum, the flickering light of torches casting long shadows against the trees. Celeste stood in the center of a clearing deep in the bayou, her staff planted firmly in the damp earth. Around her the bayou circle had gathered. Solomon, Nettie, Tijan, Isabeau, the Gauthier twins, and Père Lenoir, all standing solemn beneath the hanging moss. The ground beneath them thrummed with energy, the spirits pressing close, drawn by the scent of offering and the steady rhythm of the drums. Claudette Gauthier, her dark curls wild and unbound, began to chant, her voice low and ancient, a melody that carried across the water. Baptiste followed, his deep baritone joining hers, their song calling forth the old ways, the rites that had been passed down through blood and bone. Solomon shifted beside Celeste, gripping the shotgun slung across his back, his gaze fixed on the darkened tree line. "You sure we ready for this, Chair?" he muttered, his voice barely above the beat of the drums. Celeste's fingers tightened around her staff, the weight of the spirits pressing against her skin like the humid night air. "Ain't got a choice," she murmured, keeping her gaze on the flickering firelight. Cajun chuckled low, his gold tooth catching the glow of the flames. "Ain't never thought I'd see the day I'd be fightin' something older than the swamp itself," he said, shaking his head. Isabeau gave him a sharp look, her pale eyes unreadable. "The swamp remembers, Cajun, and tonight we remind it who still walks here." The fire cracked, sending embers spiraling into the night, and Père Lenoir stepped forward, his wrinkled hands lifting a small clay bowl filled with dark liquid. "Le Peleyo," he intoned, his Creole thick and deliberate, his voice carrying the weight of 100 prayers. He dipped his fingers into the liquid, rum mixed with blood, and flicked it into the flames, the offering sizzling as it met the fire. The drumming grew louder, the spirits stirring, the trees swaying with a wind that did not belong to this world. Celeste closed her eyes, letting the energy coil around her, letting the spirits of her ancestors settle into her bones. "Papa Legba, Uve Barriere," she whispered, her plea carrying into the ether. The air shifted, the scent of tobacco and crossroads thickening, and she knew then the Loa were listening. The sound of rustling came from the trees, the Bayou whispering its warning, and Baptiste's head snapped up, his fingers twitching toward his blade. "Something comin'," he said, his voice steady but his stance tense. Nettie cursed under her breath, pulling a small pistol from her belt, her sharp eyes scanning the darkness. The drumbeat slowed, becoming something deeper, more insistent. And Celeste felt it then, the pressure, the weight of something pushing through. The spirits did not move like this unless something unnatural was pressing against the veil. "Hold steady," she called, her voice firm, commanding. The Bayou circle braced themselves, weapons ready, magic thrumming, the night holding its breath. A figure emerged from the trees, its form shifting like smoke, eyes glowing with the light of the deep water. It was neither man nor beast, neither dead nor living, something caught between the worlds. Celeste gritted her teeth, feeling the Loa surge within her, the spirits pressing at the edges of her skin. She could feel the weight of the moment settling over her shoulders like an iron shroud. She was no longer just Celeste Broussard. The spirits had chosen her, the Bayou had answered, and now the weight of the fight rested on her shoulders. Win or lose, she would not walk away unchanged. The thing in the darkness hissed, its shape flickering, shifting. Celeste gripped her staff tighter, voice unwavering as she whispered, "Nu fege," we make war. Chapter 10, The Flood of Shadows. The Leviathan rises. The first creature lunged, its limbs unnaturally long, its breath thick with the scent of rot and old water. Solomon fired first, the shotgun's blast ripping through the humid air, the salt round hitting home. The thing shrieked, a high, wailing sound that sent a shiver up Celeste's spine, but it didn't fall. It staggered, twisted, and kept coming. Cajun moved fast, drawing his long knife, the silver flashing as he slashed at the thing's neck. It recoiled, but it did not bleed. No, something darker, thicker, oiled out of the wound, the scent of sulfur and death curling in the air. "Murd," Nettie hissed, cocking her pistol. "They ain't dying easy." Celeste slammed her staff into the earth, her voice rising over the chaos. "Nanom bondye, nanom loayo, mwenrele o," she shouted, calling on the spirits, calling on the fire. The ground shook, the air thickening with unseen hands, the bayou itself waking beneath their feet. The creature paused, its flickering eyes locking onto her, something almost recognizing in its gaze. But it was not alone. From the darkness, more came. Dozens, hundreds, their bodies shifting like smoke and water, the veil tearing wider. Isabeau's voice rose, sharp and demanding, her hands carving symbols in the air. "This ain't just shadows," she cried. "Something's pulling them through." And then it stepped forward. The Leviathan emerged from the mist, its massive form shifting, writhing, its glowing eyes like dying embers in a pit of black water. The pressure in the air grew unbearable, like 1,000 voices howling from the depths of the bayou. The earth trembled beneath its weight, the bayou groaning in protest as the thing stretched itself into the mortal world. A scent like decayed flowers and iron filled the air, thick and cloying. The sky above them darkened, the black mist swirling, the rift widening. Celeste's heart pounded, the spirits screaming in her ears, warning, warning, warning. Père Lenoir gripped his rosary tight, his voice barely a whisper. Bon Dieu, aide-nous. Good God, help us. The Leviathan opened its mouth, and the bayou screamed. The water rose, flooding the clearing, swallowing the land, dragging the living and the dead into its depths. Celeste gasped as the force of it knocked her back, the weight of the spirits pulling at her, trying to drag her under. She thrashed, reaching for her staff, feeling the pull of the abyss, the hands of the forgotten clutching at her skin. "No!" she choked, fighting against the tide, the Loa roaring within her, refusing to be swallowed. Solomon grabbed her wrist, his grip firm, his strength keeping her anchored. "Ain't no quittin', Cher," he growled, pulling her upright. The battle was chaos, fire and water, steel and spirit, the bayou circle holding the line as the Leviathan rose higher. The rift widened, the sky turning black, the air thick with whispers not meant for mortal ears. Celeste forced herself to stand, lifting her staff, drawing every ounce of power she had left. "Nous pas peur," she bellowed, her voice booming across the swamp. "We are not afraid." The spirits answered. The bayou rose, and war began. Chapter 11. The Loa's Reckoning. The spirits take their due. The storm raged through the bayou, the winds howling like the voices of the dead. The Leviathan's emergence had torn the night open, and the spirits answered with fury. The trees groaned as the land shifted beneath the weight of the war, roots twisting like grasping hands. Celeste could feel the Loa pressing against her skin, their power searing through her bones. She had called them, and they had come, but power was never given freely. It was taken, bargained, and paid for in blood. Père Lenoir waded through the rising flood, his old voice steady even as the chaos surged around them. "Nous prions pour secours, mais nous demandons prix." We pray for help, but they ask for a price. His eyes locked on Celeste, knowing she understood what came next. The Loa were answering, but they would demand payment. Not gold, not offerings, but something deeper. Celeste gritted her teeth, her grip tightening on her staff. There was no turning back, no bargaining her way out of this. She was marked, chosen, and she would pay whatever price the spirits demanded. Solomon fired another round, the blast cracking through the storm, but the Leviathan barely flinched. The thing moved slow, deliberate, as if it knew time was on its side. It did not fear them. T-Jean cursed under his breath, slashing at the spectral figures emerging from the mist, their hollow eyes empty voids. Nettie shouted something, but the wind swallowed her words, the roar of the storm drowning out everything but the screams of the land itself. The bayou was alive, fighting back. Celeste thrust her staff forward, summoning the Loa's wrath, and the air exploded with light. The ground beneath them cracked, roots surging up like living things, ensnaring the Leviathan's shifting form. It wailed, its many voices colliding in a symphony of agony. But still it did not fall. The spirits coiled around it, whispering ancient curses, the weight of forgotten souls pressing against its unnatural flesh. It was strong, but so was the land. And then the Loa spoke through Celeste, their voice layered over hers, something old and unbreakable. "Où pagen place is it? You have no place here," the storm answered, a bolt of lightning splitting the sky, striking the Leviathan's form. For the first time the creature screamed. And Celeste knew the war had truly begun. Chapter 12. Blood in the Water, a debt to be paid. The Leviathan recoiled, its form flickering, as though struggling to hold itself together. The lightning strike had not destroyed it, but it had weakened it, made it vulnerable. Celeste could feel it, the power shifting, the balance tipping, but it was not enough. Not yet. The floodwaters churned, bodies and shadows clashing beneath the waves, and the Loa still waited, their presence curling around her like unseen hands. They had given her strength, but they had not yet collected their due. Nettie staggered back, her pistol empty, her breath ragged. "We need a way to pin it down," she yelled, scanning the battlefield. Solomon slammed the butt of his shotgun against one of the spectral figures clawing toward him, its form dissolving like mist. "How the hell you pin down a damn thing that don't bleed?" he growled, reloading. Cajun dodged a swipe from a shadowed form, his knife flashing in the dim light. "You don't," he grunted. "You drown it." Celeste's breath caught. The rift. The Leviathan had come from the deep, from a wound in the land. If they could force it back, if they could close the wound while it still lingered between worlds, maybe, just maybe, they could send it back for good. But the Loa's price had not yet been paid. Celeste turned to Isabeau, who was murmuring a spell, her fingers slick with blood as she drew symbols into the wet earth. "You know what they're asking, don't you?" Celeste whispered. Isabeau's pale gaze met hers knowing. "It won't be small," she murmured. Baptiste drove a spear into one of the spectral figures, its form breaking apart with a shriek. "We don't have time for hesitation, Celeste." The bayou churned, the Leviathan rising again, its many eyes watching her. The Loa's voices whispered in her ears, calling her name, and Celeste knew the price was hers alone to pay. Chapter 13. The Bargain. One life for the land. Celeste stood at the edge of the spirit realm, her breath shallow, her pulse drumming against her ribs. The air around her was thick, not with heat, but with something unseen, something old that pressed against her skin like invisible hands. Maman Brigitte stood before her, tall and unmoving, the flickering lantern light casting long shadows across her face. "You call us when the land screams, Phil," she murmured, her voice carrying across the space between worlds. "You beg for our power, but the Loa ain't charity. We deal in debts." Celeste knew this, had always known it, but it was different when the moment came to pay. "What's the price?" Celeste asked, steady despite the weight of the spirits pressing down on her. Maman Brigitte grinned, slow and knowing, her gold tooth flashing in the dim glow. "Price depends on how much you want to win." The ground beneath Celeste shifted, the water lapping at her ankles, the voices of the dead curling around her ears. "One life for the land," the Loa intoned, the voices overlapping, a chorus of the forgotten. Maman Brigitte's grin never faded, but her eyes darkened, the flickering lantern light swallowed by something deeper. "And don't you forget, Phil," she murmured, stepping closer. "What's owed must always be paid, one way or another." Celeste swallowed, her stomach twisting, knowing that power was never taken, it was borrowed, and borrowed things always had to be returned. Chapter 14. The Rift Closes. Sealing the deep, the Leviathan howled as the Loa's magic twisted through the air, its form flickering like something caught between worlds. Celeste raised her staff, the words of Maman Brigitte still burning in her mind, the bargain weighing heavy on her soul. The spirits pressed closer, wrapping around her shoulders, whispering promises she didn't trust but had no choice but to accept. The bayou churned beneath their feet, the water rising, as if the land itself was trying to pull the creature back where it belonged. "Now, Celeste!" Isabeau shouted, her voice sharp and urgent, her hands dripping with the blood she had used to carve the sigils. Celeste didn't hesitate. She slammed her staff into the ground, and the Loa answered. The rift shuddered, the air splitting with a crack that rattled through Celeste's ribs, and the Leviathan let out a sound that was more than a scream. It was a warning. The creature twisted, its massive body writhing against the pull of the magic, fighting to remain in this world. Celeste gritted her teeth, her knuckles white against her staff, pushing everything she had into the spell. The spirits coiled tighter, the bayou humming with the energy of something ancient, something older than men's prayers. And then it broke. The rift collapsed in on itself, dragging the Leviathan down, 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 its hollow wail swallowed by the churning waters. As the rift sealed, the Leviathan let out one last sound, something beyond a scream, beyond language, something that vibrated through Celeste's bones like the toll of a great bell. The ground shook, the trees groaned, and for the briefest moment the stars above seemed to flicker. And then, silence. The bayou, once raging with magic and fury, now lay still, the water reflecting the moonlight like a sheet of black glass. Celeste stumbled back, breathless, her body trembling from the Loa's lingering energy. Around her, the bayou circle stood in stunned exhaustion, their weapons slack, their bodies covered in sweat, dirt, and something darker. But Celeste barely had time to breathe before she felt it, the shift. The Leviathan was gone, but something else had changed. It was subtle, a ripple in the air, a sensation that prickled at the back of her neck. The rift had closed, but the balance had not been restored. The Loa had taken their payment, but their voices still whispered, low and unreadable. Something was waiting, watching, and it wasn't finished. Jonathan St. James stood near the water's edge, watching the place where the rift had been, his expression unreadable. "Well," he murmured, brushing dust from his sleeve, "that was quite the spectacle." Celeste didn't trust the way he said it, didn't like the way his eyes lingered on the place where the rift had closed. Mama V's words came to her then, unbidden, whispering from the back of her mind. "That man ain't right, Celeste. You watch him close." And in her gut, she knew this wasn't over, not even close. Chapter 15. The price paid, a new shadow rises. The sun rose slow over the bayou, its golden light cutting through the mist, casting long shadows against the trees. The battle was won, but the weight of the night still pressed heavy on Celeste's chest. She sat on Mama V's porch, a cup of chicory coffee cooling in her hands, watching the swamp as if it might shift again at any moment. The price had been paid, the spirits had been satisfied, for now. But Celeste knew better than to believe it was truly over. The Loa never took only what they asked for. They always took what was owed. Jonathan St. James sat across from her, his chair rocking lazily, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp. "Strange thing about rifts," he mused, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. "Close one, and sometimes another one opens somewhere else." Celeste's eyes flicked toward him, watching the way he watched her. He had shown up too conveniently, too calm in the face of what he had seen. "You came here for answers," she said, voice low even. "Or did you come here to make sure I didn't find any?" Jonathan's lips curled into a slow smile, unreadable. "Maybe a little of both, Miss Broussard." Mama V stepped onto the porch, her cane tapping against the wooden planks, her gaze settling on Jonathan like a wolf scenting danger. "That man got snake eyes, Celeste," she muttered, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. "You best watch where he slithers." Celeste nodded once, slow, already knowing Mama V was right. Jonathan St. James wasn't just here to investigate. He was waiting for something. And if Celeste had learned one thing from the Loa, it was that nothing ever came without consequence. The bayou was quiet now, but it was a fragile silence, the kind that came before the next storm. The trees stood still, their twisted branches etched against the morning sky, the mist curling at the edges of the swamp like fingers reaching for something unseen. Celeste set her coffee down, the taste of earth and bitterness still lingering on her tongue. The battle was done, but the war had just begun. And this time, the enemy had a name, and he was already sitting across from her, smiling like he'd already won. Chapter 16. Shadows at the Crossroads. The Devil's Smile. Celeste had never trusted men who spoke too smooth and moved too carefully, and Jonathan St. James was both. He sipped his coffee like he belonged there, like the bayou itself had welcomed him, but Celeste could feel the land recoiling beneath his presence. The spirits had gone quiet around him, their whispers distant, uncertain, and that alone put her on edge. The way his fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair, slow and measured, reminded her of the way a hunter watched prey before the kill. He wasn't just here to investigate, he was waiting. And the worst part was, Celeste didn't know for what. "A woman like you carries a heavy burden," Jonathan said, breaking the silence. His voice was deep, rich like aged bourbon, laced with something almost hypnotic. Celeste didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't give him the satisfaction of knowing his words unsettled her. Fighting spirits, making bargains, wielding magic older than the trees themselves, must be exhausting. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes gleaming in the dim morning light. Must be tempting, sometimes, to let go, let someone else carry the weight. The words curled around her like smoke, and Celeste recognized them for what they were, a lure. Mama V's cane slammed against the porch boards, her sharp gaze cutting through the humid air. "You a smooth talker, ain't you?" she muttered, her Creole thick, her voice edged with steel. Jonathan turned to her, polite smile in place, but Mama V didn't blink. "I done lived long enough to know when a man's lips move prettier than his soul. And you, garçon?" You got the kind of smile the devil wears when he makes a deal he already know he gonna win. Celeste hid her smirk behind her cup, but she felt the weight of Mama V's words settle deep in her chest. She wasn't sure if Jonathan was the devil in disguise, but she damn sure knew he wanted something only she could give. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp moss and something older, heavier. Celeste felt it before she heard it, the pull of the crossroads. A ripple in the air, a shift in reality, the kind that made the spirits stir like restless children. The trees seemed to pull away from Jonathan, their moss-laden branches twisting as if trying to retreat. The bayou had always whispered, always stirred, but now it held its breath. Jonathan's smile widened just slightly, like he could feel it too, and that was enough to make Celeste stand. "If you came for answers, Mr. St. James, then you best be ready to earn 'em." She turned toward the dirt road winding through the swamp, her voice steady. "Crossroads don't give nothing for free, and neither do I." Chapter 17. The Ghost of John Lafitte. The past never stays buried. The crossroads weren't like the rest of the bayou. The air felt heavier, the earth older, and the trees leaned in like they were listening, like they remembered every deal made under their branches. Celeste had walked this path before, had stood at the edge of decisions that could change the shape of a soul, and tonight was no different. The spirits had been restless ever since the Leviathan fell, and she knew something was coming, something that had been waiting for a door to open, and she had the sinking feeling Jonathan St. James was the key someone had been looking for. The earth trembled beneath their steps, the smell of burning tobacco curling through the air. "You ever hear the tale of Jean Lafitte?" Jonathan asked as they neared the clearing. Celeste didn't answer, but she knew he wasn't really asking. "Pirate, smuggler. Some say he made a deal with Baron Samedi himself to escape the noose." He exhaled slowly, like he was savoring the words. "Problem with deals like that? They don't ever really end." Celeste shot him a sharp glance, but he was watching the clearing ahead, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, like a man too at ease in the presence of ghosts. The moment they stepped into the center of the crossroads, the world shifted. The cicadas stopped singing, the wind died, and the ground beneath them shivered. Celeste had seen plenty of spirits in her time, but when the figure emerged from the mist, she felt the weight of history itself pressing against her ribs. Jean Lafitte was supposed to be a legend, a ghost story whispered in the taverns of New Orleans, but there he stood, his form flickering like candlelight, his eyes like black glass. "A debt is still owed," the spirit rasped, his voice like the scrape of a knife on bone. The words didn't just hang in the air, they sank, heavy as stone, pressing against Celeste's ribs like a hand reaching through time. The air thickened, the scent of brine and gunpowder curling through the mist. Jean Lafitte had not forgotten, and neither had the spirits that held his soul tethered to this place. Jonathan stepped forward, his expression unreadable, and Celeste felt her stomach twist. "What debt?" she asked, but Lafitte's gaze never left Jonathan. The spirit knew him, recognized him, and that realization sent a chill through Celeste's bones. Jonathan St. James wasn't just a man looking for answers. He was part of whatever darkness had been waiting at the edge of the veil. Chapter 18. The veil cracks, a gate best left closed. The moment Jonathan's fingers brushed the air, the world lurched. The mist thickened, swirling violently, twisting into unnatural shapes that flickered like shadows caught between realities. The wind howled, sharp and biting, sending the scent of brine and rot through the clearing. Celeste's breath caught in her throat, her grip tightening on her staff as the pressure in the air changed. It wasn't just the spirits reacting, it was the land itself. The trees groaned, their ancient limbs trembling, as though something unseen had grabbed hold of their roots and pulled. "Step back," Celeste warned, but Jonathan didn't move. He stood at the heart of it all, his face unreadable, his dark eyes reflecting the eerie glow that had begun seeping through the tear in the veil. Jean Lafitte's ghost flickered, his form pulsing with a strange energy, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no sound came out. The spirits were whispering, their voices rising, layering over one another until they became a single deafening wail. Celeste felt it in her bones, in the marrow of her soul. This was not supposed to happen. The crossroads had always been a place of power. A place of passage, but this was a wound. Then the first hand reached through. It was long and thin, its fingers stretched too far, the skin dark and slick as if it had been soaking beneath the bayou's surface for centuries. The thing that crawled through the veil was not a spirit, not a ghost. It was something older. Celeste took a step back, her heart hammering, the presence before her reeking of decay and desperation. It had no eyes, no mouth, only the suggestion of a face stretched over bone and sinew, yet somehow she knew it could see her. Jonathan, for the first time, looked pleased. "You really don't know what you're standing in front of, do you?" he murmured, tilting his head as he watched the creature emerge. His voice was almost admiring, like a scholar finally seeing proof of a long-lost legend. Celeste wanted to shove him away, but it was too late. The thing had already pulled itself free, its body twisting unnaturally, its limbs jerking like a marionette controlled by unseen hands. Jean Lafitte's ghost flickered, his form distorted by the presence of the creature, as if the spirit world itself was struggling to accommodate something that did not belong. Celeste knew she had two choices: fight now, or let it drag the bayou into something far worse. "Jonathan, close it," she ordered, her voice sharp, but he only smiled, stepping back like a man who had done exactly what he came to do. The creature twitched, its head snapping toward her, and she felt it then, not just hunger but recognition. This thing had been waiting, reaching, searching for something on this side of the veil, and now, thanks to Jonathan St. James, it had found her. Chapter 19, A Debt Paid in Blood. The Echoes of Broken Promises. Celeste moved first. She slammed her staff into the damp earth, summoning the Loa's fire, watching as the flames licked up from the soil like a serpent uncoiling. The creature flinched, its body jerking backward, but it did not retreat. Its limbs reformed, shifting in and out of shape as if it was still deciding what it wanted to be. The veil behind it shimmered, still open, still pulling at the edges of reality, threatening to widen. Celeste could hear the spirits shrieking, warning her, urging her to seal it before it was too late. But Jonathan only watched, his gaze calm, his hands still tucked into the pockets of his waistcoat like none of this concerned him. "You fool!" Jean Lafitte rasped, his ghostly form struggling against the pull of the thing before him. "You think you control this? You think it listens to you?" The pirate's voice was filled with ancient rage, his presence flickering, unstable. Celeste had never seen a spirit react like this, had never seen one so close to being torn apart. "This ain't no contract, no deal you can talk your way out of, boy. You opened a door that was meant to stay shut." The creature twitched, its head turning sharply toward Lafitte's spirit, and for a moment the very air shivered. Celeste knew what was coming before it happened. The creature was trying to consume him. "No!" Celeste lunged forward, thrusting her staff between the thing and the spirit of Lafitte. The fire surged, crackling, burning unnaturally bright as it wrapped around the creature's reaching limbs. It let out a soundless wail, recoiling, but its focus had already shifted. It wanted more than Jean Lafitte. It wanted Celeste. She felt it, deep in her bones, the way it stretched toward her, the way it recognized something in her blood. This thing had been waiting for her, for someone like her, to open the gate completely. Jonathan laughed. It wasn't a loud sound, wasn't mocking, just amused, like a man watching a chessboard shift exactly as he had planned. "You really don't get it, do you?" he mused. "This was never about the rift, never about the Leviathan. That was just the first movement in a much bigger game." He took a step back, tipping his hat as if he were leaving a dinner party instead of abandoning them to face an unspeakable horror. Celeste's fury ignited, but there was no time, because the creature lunged again, and this time it was stronger. Chapter 20. The Devil's Handshake. A Deal That Should Never Be Made. The world erupted. The bayou, the spirits, the wind, everything surged at once, responding to the horror clawing its way further into this world. Celeste called on the Loa, on the land, on anything that would listen, but the creature was still there, still reaching, still waiting. The fire was not enough. The barriers were not enough. Something else had to be given. Jean Lafitte turned toward her, his ghostly form flickering like a dying flame. "You want to stop it, Phil?" His voice was hoarse, desperate. "Then you gotta do what should have been done centuries ago." He turned his palm upward, revealing the sigil still burned into his ghostly flesh. The contract, the blood magic debt. Celeste's stomach twisted. She had spent her whole life bargaining with spirits, but this was something else. This was binding. Jonathan, still standing at the edges of the chaos, smirked. This is what they do, you know. Make you choose the lesser evil. Make you wonder if you're just as bad as the ones before you. He shrugged. Either you pay the price, or you let it take what it wants. Celeste knew what it wanted. Her blood, her power, the magic tied to her soul. If she didn't act, the creature would claim what it was promised, and this time, the veil would never close. Fine, she hissed, slashing her palm with her own blade and slamming it over John Lafitte's mark. The sigil flared. The world screamed. The flames surged. The creature let out a soundless shriek, and for the briefest moment, Celeste saw what was waiting on the other side. 100 hands, 1,000 eyes, something far worse than anything they had faced before. And then, the veil slammed shut. The Bayou fell silent. Jonathan St. James gave her one last knowing smile before tipping his hat and vanishing into the mist. Celeste, her breath ragged, her hand still bleeding, knew the truth before she even spoke it. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Chapter 21. The silence after the storm. Something was left behind. The bayou had never felt so quiet. The trees no longer whispered, the water no longer carried the voices of spirits, and even the air itself seemed hesitant to move. Celeste stood at the edge of the crossroads, her blood still drying on her palm, the sigil still faintly glowing against Jean Lafitte's spectral hand. The creature was gone, the veil was closed, but something wasn't right. She could feel it, a wrongness in the air, like the world had not fully settled back into place. Jonathan St. James had walked away with his smirk, but he had left something behind. She was sure of it. Mama V had warned her about men like him, the ones who moved like shadows and spoke in circles. Celeste exhaled, grounding herself in the damp earth beneath her feet, trying to push past the feeling of something unfinished. Jean Lafitte's ghost had not disappeared, his flickering form still lingering beside her, his expression unreadable. "What now?" she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. The pirate chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "Now, Phila, you start asking the right questions, like what that bastard really came here for." Celeste turned toward the darkened path leading back to town, the weight of the night still pressing on her chest. The spirits should have been calm now, but they weren't. She could feel them still stirring, restless, waiting for something. That wasn't how this was supposed to end. The Loa had accepted her blood, the debt had been paid, the rift had closed. But if that were truly the case, then why did she still feel like she was standing on the edge of a storm? It was slow at first, just a ripple across the surface, but then the water stilled, not like it was settling, but like something beneath it had stopped moving. Watching, waiting. The thought crawled beneath her skin, sinking deep into her bones as she turned back to Jean. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice firm, steady. "Tell me what you know about him, about Jonathan St. James." Jean smirked, but it was a tired one, his ghostly fingers tracing over the sigil on his palm. "Now that," he drawled, "is a tale that don't end well for the ones who start asking." Chapter 22. Jonathan's Trail. A man with no past. Celeste spent the next day following every whisper, every lead, every buried truth about Jonathan St. James. No one knew where he had come from, only that he had arrived as if he had always been there. No childhood, no family name beyond what he gave, no trace of history that wasn't wrapped in half-truths and polite deception. Even in the dusty archives of old land deeds and lost records, his name did not appear. It was as if he had stepped into existence the moment he walked into the bayou, as if he had been created for this very purpose. But there was one name she did find, a name that made her stomach tighten and her breath come short. St. James wasn't his first name. The name that appeared, scrawled in ink on the oldest surviving documents of this land, was Elias St. James. A man listed as a sugar baron in the early 1800s, one who had disappeared without a trace after rumors of a dark bargain gone wrong. Celeste's fingers tightened on the brittle parchment, her heart pounding as she traced the faded ink. Elias St. James had been a man who should have been dead, and yet somehow he was here. She knew now. Jonathan St. James wasn't just playing a game. he was part of something much, much older than he had let on. "He's not just a liar," Celeste murmured, staring at the name that should have been buried centuries ago. "He's a ghost in his own way, a man walking outside his own time." Her breath hitched. Not from fear, but from understanding. If he had walked through time untouched, then what else had he walked through? What had he seen? And more importantly, what had he promised? Jean Lafitte's form flickered beside her, his smirk knowing. "Told you, Phil, some debts don't stay buried." The spirits had been right to fear him. The Bayou had been right to recoil from him. Celeste swallowed hard as she rolled the parchment closed, her grip tight. Because if Jonathan St. James was the same Elias St. James from 200 years ago, then the real question was what had kept him alive. Chapter 23, The Revenant's Curse. A man who cannot die. The spirits spoke in riddles, but Celeste could feel the truth taking shape. Jonathan, or Elias, had been tied to something unnatural, something that had kept him from death's grip for centuries. The sigil burned into Jean Lafitte's palm wasn't just a contract. It was a binding. A mark of a man who had already given his soul away, a man who was never meant to pass into the afterlife. That was why the spirits had grown silent around him. They did not see him as living, nor did they see him as dead. He was something else, something caught between the worlds, something that should not exist. "What kind of deal did you make?" Celeste murmured, staring into the flames of her small campfire. The Bayou had turned still, the weight of knowledge pressing down on her like a heavy fog. Mama V had always warned her about unnatural things, about men who came with hollow smiles and silver tongues. But she had never mentioned a man who had cheated death itself. The Loa had taken payment in blood from Celeste, but they had taken nothing from Jonathan. That meant one thing: he had already paid his price long ago. But if his deal had been settled, why was he still here? What debt had been left unpaid? Jean Lafitte's ghost flickered in the corner of her vision, his arms crossed, his smirk grim. "You ever wonder why he never gets his hands dirty, Phil? Why he's always the one pulling strings but never the one holding the blade?" Celeste exhaled slowly, the truth settling heavy in her bones. Because Jonathan St. James could not die. He had been locked out of the cycle of life and death, cursed to exist between worlds, always pushing his own fate forward, always searching for the next move. And now, he had brought her into it. She had been part of his design from the very beginning. Celeste clenched her jaw, forcing herself to think past the fear that clawed at her spine. If Jonathan had already paid his price but was still bound to something, then his debt was not yet settled. And debts like that always demanded something in return. If he had spent centuries looking for a way out, what if she was it? What if the only way for him to be free was through her? The realization made her skin go cold. She needed to stop him before the blood moon rose, before whatever was waiting for him realized that she was the final key. Chapter 24, The Blood Moon's Return. The time of the dead is near. The sky had already begun to change, the moon's silver hue shifting as red bled into it like ink spilled on parchment. Celeste had always known the Bayou held secrets, but the sight of the blood moon sent unease curling deep in her stomach. This wasn't just another night. The last time the blood moon had risen, the Leviathan had crawled through the rift. And now, something worse was coming. She could feel it in her bones, in the heavy stillness that stretched between the trees. The Bayou was watching. It knew what was about to happen. She moved through the waterlogged path back toward Mama V's cabin, her pulse drumming in her ears. The spirits had gone quiet again, just like they had before Jonathan had first arrived. That wasn't a coincidence. If he had spent centuries tied to a contract, then his time was running out. The blood moon wasn't just a warning, it was a summons. The moment the sky turned fully crimson, his debt would come calling. And Celeste had a sinking feeling that she was supposed to be the offering. Mama V was waiting on the porch, her face shadowed, her cane tapping against the wooden planks in a slow, deliberate rhythm. "It's comin', sooner than we thought," she murmured, not looking up as Celeste climbed the steps. "The spirit's been whisperin', but now they ain't whisperin' no more. They screamin', girl." Celeste swallowed the lump in her throat, setting the papers down on the small wooden table beside them. "It's him," she said, and Mama V finally turned to look at her. Jonathan, he's not just playing with the veil, he's the reason it's breaking. Mama V's eyes darkened, her fingers tightening around the head of her cane. I knew that man carried a bad weight, but this? She shook her head. You tell me the spirits don't know where he belong, 'cause he don't belong nowhere? Celeste nodded, the truth tasting bitter on her tongue. He should be dead, she said, but he ain't, and now I think whatever let him walk free back then is coming to collect. The older woman let out a slow breath, her expression unreadable. Then you best be ready, girl. 'Cause when that moon turns full red, you ain't just fighting him. You fightin' whatever he owes. A sharp gust of wind slammed against her back, rattling the porch, and in that moment she heard it. A whisper, low and ancient, curling through the air like the breath of something waking up. The ground beneath her feet trembled. The wind picked up, rattling the glass bottles that hung from the porch, their eerie chimes filling the thick night air. Celeste felt it before she saw it. A shift, a pull, a presence settling in the bayou like a beast stretching in its sleep. The blood moon had not yet fully risen, but the veil was already thinning. The last time she had stood at this crossroads, she had barely survived. This time, she wasn't sure if survival was part of the plan at all. Chapter 25, The Gathering Storm. A reckoning, written in blood. The blood moon continued its slow ascent, painting the bayou in eerie shades of crimson. Celeste stood outside Mama V's cabin, feeling the weight of the spirits pressing against her, their voices murmuring just beneath the surface of her thoughts. The bayou circle had gathered, Solomon, Nettie, Cajun, Isabeau, and the Gothia twins, all standing in a loose half-circle, their expressions grim, their weapons and charms ready. They had faced dark things before, but tonight they weren't just fighting spirits. Tonight, they were fighting something older, something that had kept Elias St. James, Jonathan St. James, alive for centuries. "You sure 'bout dis, chair?" Solomon asked, adjusting the strap of his shotgun. His dark eyes flicked toward the horizon, where the thick mist of the bayou had begun to move, twisting in unnatural patterns. "Whatever dis is, it been waiting long enough, and dat kind of patience." He shook his head. "That's dangerous." Celeste nodded, gripping her staff tighter. "Ain't no running now, Solomon. He's already here." She could feel Jonathan's presence just beyond the veil, lingering like a storm waiting to break. Mama V stepped forward, her cane tapping against the wooden planks. She hadn't spoken much since Celeste told her the truth about Jonathan, but now she looked her in the eyes, searching for something. "Dis ain't gon' be no ordinary fight, bebe," she murmured. "Dis gon' be blood for blood. You ready for dat?" Celeste swallowed hard, but she didn't flinch. "Don't matter if I'm ready, Mama. It's here." The old woman sighed, nodding once. "Then we best not waste time." A low hum filled the air, the same sound Celeste had heard when the Leviathan had come through the veil. The trees shuddered, the ground trembled, and somewhere in the mist, something shifted. Cajun whistled low under his breath. "Well, that don't sound like no friendly ghost." The bayou exhaled, and then, just like that, Jonathan St. James stepped through the mist. He looked as he always had, impossibly composed, too calm for a man who had walked outside of time itself. But there was something different in his eyes tonight. They burned. Chapter 26, The Devil's Gambit, The Circle Must Hold. "You came faster than I expected," Jonathan drawled, adjusting his gloves, his dark coat billowing in the unnatural wind. "I suppose I should be flattered." Celeste's grip on her staff tightened, the Loa stirring inside her, their power pressing against her ribs. "Cut the bullshit," she snapped. "I know what you are, I know what you did, and I know what's coming for you." Jonathan smirked, tilting his head slightly. "Ah, so you finally put the pieces together." Jean Lafitte's ghost flickered beside Celeste, his expression set in stone. "He ain't here to fight you, Phil. He here to finish what he started." The pirate turned his gaze to Jonathan. "You still think you gone outplay this thing, Elias?" Jonathan's smirk didn't falter, but there was something sharp in his eyes. "I don't intend to play at all," he murmured. "I intend to win." The bayou roared. A wave of dark energy surged through the clearing, nearly knocking Celeste off her feet. The sigil on Jean's palm flared, burning bright as something ancient and hungry pushed against the veil. The air thickened, the shadows deepened, and Celeste could see them now, the hands reaching through the tear in the world, clawing for Jonathan. His debt had come due. "Dis ain't gonna go how you think, garçon," Mama V called, stepping forward. Her voice was steady, but there was something in her stance, something Celeste had never seen before. "You think you walkin' round all dis time making your own way, but dat debt?" Her eyes gleamed in the moonlight. "It was never yours to pay alone." Jonathan's expression shifted. For the first time, he looked truly caught off guard. "What do you mean?" The wind howled, and then the truth fell into place. Chapter 27, The Last Oath. Mama V's Bargain. The Loa had always been watching. Jonathan had spent centuries believing he had outmaneuvered them, that he had escaped his fate. But fate wasn't something you escaped. It was something that followed. And Mama V, for all her wisdom, had known exactly how this was going to end. She had known it from the moment she laid eyes on him. "I done seen men like you before," she said, stepping closer, the wind whipping at her shawl. "Men who think they too smart, too careful, too lucky to get caught up in what they owe. But that ain't how dis work, Elias." Jonathan's jaw tensed. He knew. And yet, until this moment, he had refused to believe it. "You already paid your price," Mama V murmured, her voice laced with something old. "But what you didn't know." She tilted her head, her dark eyes sharp as a blade. "Somebody else been holding dat debt for you. Somebody else been keeping you walking all this time." Celeste's heart stopped. The Loa weren't waiting for Jonathan to pay. They were waiting for Mama V. "Non," Celeste whispered, stepping forward. But Mama V raised a hand, stopping her. "Don't fight dis, bebe. It already done." Celeste shook her head, panic surging through her chest. "No, you can't, Mama. You can't." Mama V smiled, sad, knowing, ain't no stoppin' what already been set in motion. And then the Loa took her. Chapter 28. The veil closes. A life for a life. Celeste's scream tore through the night as Mama V's body collapsed onto the damp earth. The moment the old woman's breath left her body, the air shattered like glass, splitting open as the veil widened into a gaping maw. The bayou trembled under the weight of something ancient, something that had been waiting too long to collect its due. Celeste reached for her, but the second her fingers touched Mama V's cooling skin, a force ripped through her chest like a bolt of lightning. The Loa had come, not as shadows, but as a storm. They swirled in an unseen whirlwind, their voices a chorus of something too vast, too powerful for human tongues to translate. The wind screamed through the trees, the bayou itself recoiling as if recognizing what had been lost. The ground beneath Celeste's feet trembled, a slow, mournful shake, like the earth itself had bowed its head in grief. Jonathan stumbled backward, his composure finally fracturing as he stared at the void that had opened before him. For the first time since Celeste had met him, she saw fear in his eyes. The weight of realization struck him like a hammer. This was not how he had planned for his game to end. He had thought he could outmaneuver fate, twist the rules to his favor as he had done for centuries. But he had never accounted for this. He had never counted on Mama V making the move he wasn't willing to make. "Dis ain't how it was supposed to go," he whispered, shaking his head, but his voice lacked the confidence it once held. The spirit surged forward, the mist rising like grasping hands, pulling at him, wrapping around his limbs, dragging him toward the rift. He fought, but there was no escaping it now. The Loa had come to balance the scales. He thrashed as the unseen forces wrapped tighter, his eyes locking onto Celeste's with something almost pleading. "You know me, Cher. You know I ain't supposed to go like this," but his words were swallowed by the storm. Celeste could only watch, helpless, as Jonathan St. James was dragged into the depths. His body twisted unnaturally, folding into the darkness, swallowed piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the whisper of a name carried on the wind. The moment he vanished, the rift snapped shut, like the mouth of a beast finally sated after a centuries-long hunger. The pressure in the air lifted instantly, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the bayou exhaled. But Celeste could not breathe. She could not move. The silence that followed was deafening. The trees, once groaning in protest, now stood still. The wind had ceased its wailing. The spirits had gone quiet. Celeste's breath came in slow, uneven gasps as she turned back to Mama V's lifeless body, her shaking hands hovering over her. "No, non." Her voice was hoarse, her throat raw. "Mama, wake up! Please wake up!" But there was no answer, only the sound of water lapping against the shore and the weight of a debt finally paid. Chapter 29, The Morning Song. She walked so they would not fall. The days after Mama V's passing felt like moving through thick water, as though time had slowed, refusing to let Celeste step forward. The Bayou was eerily still, the spirits refusing to speak, as if they too were mourning the loss of one of their own. Everything felt hollow. The circle had gathered, but their usual sharpness was dulled, their strength worn thin by grief. Solomon stood at the edge of the water, silent, his shotgun resting against his shoulder like a ghost of the battles they had fought. Nettie had tried to speak, but even her sharp tongue could find no words for what had been lost. Baptiste sat at the water's edge, his usual quietness now stretched thin, his knife digging absently into the wood of the dock. Claudette, normally the first to offer a sharp tongue, had barely spoken, her eyes locked on the trees as if waiting for a voice that would never come. Even Isabeau, whose magic rarely faltered, had taken to burning herbs over and over, whispering prayers that had no answers. Celeste sat on Mama V's porch, the weight of exhaustion pressing heavy against her bones. The old woman's chair still rocked slightly in the wind, though no one sat in it, the wood creaking like it too. Had lost something. "Ain't fair," T. muttered, breaking the silence, his voice unusually subdued. "She ain't the one dat was s'posed to go." John Lafitte's ghost had lingered longer than expected, his flickering form standing just beyond the tree line. "She knew, Phil," he finally said, his voice quieter than Celeste had ever heard it. "Knew dis was gon' be how it ended." Celeste clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "Then why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why'd she have to be the one to pay?" Jean sighed, shaking his head. "Because somebody had to, and she ain't never let nobody else carry her burdens." Celeste swallowed the lump in her throat, staring out at the water, at the endless stretch of mist that had finally begun to thin. The Loa had taken what was owed, and now the balance had been restored. But it had come at a price too steep. "She walked, so we would not fall," Nettie murmured, her hands wrapped around a tattered gris-gris bag Mama V had given her long ago. She knew what had to be done. Celeste exhaled, slow and shaky, the wind whispering through the trees. "Ain't gonna let it be for nothin'," Celeste said softly. She felt the bayou shift then, as if the land itself had heard her. The spirits would return, the whispers would start again. The work was not finished. Mama V had left a path behind for Celeste to walk, and she would walk it, no matter what came next. Chapter 30. The path left behind, the bayou remembers. The night was thick with silence, the kind that pressed against the skin like damp cloth. Celeste sat on Mama V's porch, her fingers wrapped tightly around a cup of chicory coffee that had long since gone cold. The air smelled of damp moss and lingering smoke from burned offerings, but the spirits that once hovered around this place were absent. Even the bayou, usually alive with the songs of crickets and distant alligators, seemed to be holding its breath. The weight of everything that had happened sat heavy in her chest, refusing to lift. She knew the battle was over, but the war had just begun. She had spent the day burying Mama V in the grove behind the cabin, the soil still fresh and dark where the old woman now rested. The others had helped, Solomon digging in silence, Nettie whispering prayers, Tijan lighting a cigar for the dead. They had spoken little, each lost in their own grief, knowing that something vital had been torn from them. Even John Lafitte's ghost had lingered, his presence more solid than usual, as if even in death he mourned the loss of the only woman who had ever looked him in the eye without fear. Celeste had expected some kind of sign, some final whisper from Mama V, but none came. Just silence, stretching deep into the bones of the land. That silence was shattered when the wind shifted, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of something old and restless. Celeste sat up, her body tensing as the porch chimes rattled against one another, their sound eerily discordant. Then came the voice, low, distant, curling through the mist like a whisper from the other side. "Phil, listen." Her breath caught in her throat, every muscle in her body going rigid. The voice belonged to Jonathan St. James, but it was strained, broken, barely clinging to the world of the living. Celeste rose slowly, her bare feet touching the cool wooden planks as she approached the door. Her fingers hovered over the handle, heart hammering in her chest, torn between wanting to shut out whatever this was and needing to hear the rest. "It ain't over," Jonathan's voice rasped, each syllable laced with something she wasn't sure was fear or warning. "You thought the debt was settled, but something worse is comin'. Something older. Something hungry." The air around her grew heavy, the smell of the bayou deepening, thick with the scent of damp rot and something metallic. Celeste swallowed hard, forcing herself to find her voice. "Who?" she whispered. For a moment there was only silence, stretching out so long she thought the connection had been severed. Then finally Jonathan spoke again, and this time the weight of his words sent a cold chill down her spine. Malveaux. The name was like a curse, sinking into the wood, the air, the blood beneath her skin. The wind howled suddenly, whipping through the trees with a force that rattled the windows, and just like that, the presence was gone. Celeste stood there, breathing hard, the taste of something bitter on her tongue. The spirits had returned, their whispers rising again in the night air, and now they were no longer mourning, they were warning.